The merciless wind howled through the cracks of the old wooden cabin, carrying with it the silent cries of an arid and unforgiving land. In the vast and forgotten desert of the American Old West, Mary, a young widow of just 30, and her two small children, Lily, 7 years old, with her curious eyes and straw-colored hair, and Tom, 5, a thin, quiet boy with a tattered teddy bear, fought a daily battle against hunger and despair. The small field around the cabin, once fertile enough to sustain a small subsistence crop of corn. She patched tattered clothes, using pieces of old flour sacks to cover holes. She made bread with the little cornmeal she could buy in the nearest town, Dusty Gulch, a 2-day wagon journey that became a true odyssey, selling the few eggs her 2 surviving chickens laid. At night, by the flickering light of an oil lamp that Mary conserved as much as possible, she told stories to her children, tales of brave cowboys and wise Indians, trying to distract them from the rumbling of their own stomachs. But with each passing day, the shadow of starvation loomed closer, thicker and more menacing. Hope, a candle she strove to keep lit with all her might, flickered dangerously, threatening to go out at any moment. And beans was now parched and barren due to a prolonged drought that had plagued the region for over a year. As a widow, with no close relatives or community support, in an inhospitable land forgotten by law and luck, Mary faced the impossibility of providing for her children. The small, rough town of Dusty Gulch, composed of miners and ranchers who could barely support themselves, offered little help. Charity was a luxury few could afford in a place where everyone fought for themselves. Mary had tried to sell John's few remaining belongings, an old saddle, some mining tools, but the money barely bought a bag of beans, which only lasted a few days. With each passing day, the decision to leave and try their luck elsewhere, perhaps in distant and promising San Francisco, weighed more heavily on her heart. But the idea of abandoning John's land, where his dreams had been buried, felt like a betrayal. The central problem was the impending catastrophe that awaited them if nothing changed. They were on the brink of an abyss, and time was rapidly running out. The few seeds Mary tried to plant simply refused to sprout. Wild animals, once a sporadic source of food like rabbits and partridges, became increasingly scarce, forcing Mary to spend exhausting hours searching for any creature to feed her children. Hunting had become an almost impossible task for a lone woman with little physical strength and none of a hunter's skill. Lily and Tom, though small, understood the gravity of the situation. Their young faces, often smudged with dust and fatigue, bore a seriousness unusual for children their age. They played little, spoke softly, and their big, curious eyes always turned to Mary, seeking comfort and the certainty that there would be food for the next meal. Hunger was a constant presence, a tight knot in their stomachs that never unraveled. Each day was a monotonous repetition of silent prayers beneath a collapsing roof, their lives marked by absence and the burden of a recent tragedy. Mary's husband, John, a hard-working miner and the family's pillar, had succumbed to mountain fever just a few months prior. His death left them with almost nothing but a debt of grief and the cabin that barely protected them from the elements. It was a precarious structure, with cracked walls that let in the biting wind and a roof that leaked with every rain, turning the dirt floor into mud. Even so, for Mary, maintaining that place was a way to keep John's memory alive, a silent promise that they would survive, no matter how difficult it became. Life was a constant struggle, a desperate dance with scarcity. Mary, with her calloused hands, brittle nails, and tireless spirit, did what she could with the few resources she possessed. The central conflict was brutally simple: survival in an environment that seemed to conspire against them. One morning, the desolate silence of the desert, usually broken only by the wind and the distant howl of coyotes, was suddenly interrupted by a faint but noticeable cry, a muffled groan of pain. Mary, who was sitting by the fireplace, mending an old shirt of John's with thread so thin it was almost invisible, raised her head, her heart clenched by a premonition. It wasn't the sound of a wounded animal, nor the familiar wail of the wind. His half-closed eyes opened for an instant, revealing a flicker of agony and a silent plea, a wordless call for help. His body was surprisingly heavy, and the effort left her breathless, her muscles burning. Lily and Tom, curious and a little scared, watched in silence, their eyes wide as the stranger was brought into their small sanctuary. Mary tried to ignore them, focused on saving him, but the words echoed in her mind, planting a seed of curiosity. Mary felt a strange gratitude for his appearance, as if her suffering had given a new purpose to her existence. And Jed, even in his unconscious state, felt the dedication and care she and the children offered, a sense of warmth and security he hadn't felt in a long time. The cabin, once a home of silence, despair, and resignation, now had a new sound, the noisy and intermittent breathing of a wounded man, but alive, fighting to return. And amidst all this uncertainty, a question grew stronger and echoed in Mary's heart. What would this strange and unexpected presence bring them? What fate awaited that small, isolated family in the vast and dangerous desert of the Old West? Who was this man, and why was he so badly wounded? The secondary conflicts were clear and grew by the hour. The struggle to keep Jed alive as their own resources dwindled alarmingly, and the growing unknown about the cowboy's identity, who carried an aura of danger and mystery. Mary, with the few skills John had taught her about first aid for mining accidents, and with the folk wisdom she had learned from her mother about herbs, cleaned the wound with warm water and a clean piece of cloth, applying medicinal herbs she herself collected from the dry hillsides like wild sage and echinacea. The bullet had grazed him, but the cut was deep and at risk of infection, and the blood loss was considerable. Mary didn't hesitate. Hunger and misery, which could have hardened her heart, had instead sharpened her empathy. Despite having almost nothing, she knew she couldn't simply leave him there to die under the scorching desert sun. It was something different, something unmistakably human. Lily and Tom, who were quietly playing with pieces of wood near the door, dragging them across the dirt floor to create their own roads, also heard it. Fever consumed him, making him sweat profusely and tremble uncontrollably. Mary barely slept, alternating between changing damp compresses on Jed's feverish forehead and administering thin broths made from the few ingredients she had, such as some dried vegetables and a piece of salted pork she saved for special occasions. The presence of a stranger in her home brought a new challenge. Supplies, already scarce, dwindled even more rapidly. Lily and Tom, accustomed to hunger, often gave up their small portions so the stranger would have something to eat. An act of childlike altruism that touched Mary deeply, but also made her feel the weight of her responsibility even more. Their eyes widened, fixing on Mary for an explanation. Mary hesitated for a moment, the needle suspended in the air. Danger was a constant in the Old West. Bandits, wild animals, and nature itself could appear at any moment. A man, dressed in typical cowboy attire, his hat fallen to the side and an empty gun holster at his waist, lay slumped near a mesquite bush, his face pale, gaunt, and stained with dried blood. Dust covered his clothes, clinging to sweat and blood, and a deep wound on his side bled profusely, staining the dry earth a dark red. His horse, a beautiful sorrel, with shining coat and intelligent eyes, was tied to a nearby tree, looking as exhausted and frightened as its owner. Mary noticed the horse's luxurious saddle and the expensive appearance of its tack, a stark contrast to the poverty of her own home. A wounded stranger could mean trouble, another mouth to feed, or even a risk to her small family's safety. But compassion was a force more powerful than fear in her heart. Leaving the children in Lily's care, who despite her young age was surprisingly mature and responsible, Mary grabbed John's old shotgun, a heavy, rusty weapon, more for reassurance than for actual use, and, taking a deep breath, stepped out of the cabin. Following the sound, which now repeated in whispers of pain, she found a shocking scene just a few feet from her door. The cowboy, who Mary would later discover was named Jedediah Stone, or simply Jed, was barely breathing. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, driven by adrenaline and the urgency of the situation, Mary dragged Jed into the cabin. The days that followed were a mix of tension, exhaustion, and a small spark of hope. Jed was on the brink of death. Jed remained unconscious for days, delirious and muttering incomprehensible words about gold, betrayal, and revenge. With each day of Yet's recovery, the bond between them deepened in a strange and silent way. The fever, which had kept Jedediah Stone on the brink of the abyss for so many days, finally receded like a tide pulling back, leaving him weak but conscious. Slowly he opened his eyes. For a moment, the sunlight streaming through the cabin window blinded him, and confusion filled his mind. He lay on an improvised bed, made of a few animal hides and covered with a tattered but surprisingly soft blanket. The scent of medicinal herbs and wood smoke filled the air, a familiar and comforting fragrance. His half-closed eyes fixed on Mary, who sat by the fireplace, the faint light dancing on her face as she mended a worn piece of cloth with a fine needle, her concentration almost hypnotic. He saw Mary's patched clothes, the children's worn and torn shoes, the few cooking utensils hanging on the wall, and felt the pang of hunger in his own stomach, remembering how weak he had been. He saw Mary's tireless dedication, the way she stretched herself thin to provide for her children, the resilience in her eyes, the silent strength that guided her. He saw Lily's affection, bringing him wildflowers every day, and Tom's curiosity, who watched him with childlike admiration, as if Jed were a character from his stories. Jed, a man who had spent most of his life surrounded by flatterers, opportunists, and self-serving people, felt touched by the purity of Mary's kindness and the innocence of her children. The surprise, the contained joy, but also the uncertainty and a slight distrust. He knew that from that moment on, the dynamic between them would change forever. Mary's act of kindness had unleashed something much bigger than she could have imagined. The cowboy, once just a wounded and helpless man, was now a mystery of wealth, secrets, and hidden dangers, and the fate of that small family was inextricably linked to his. The silence between them, laden with so many unspoken questions and assumptions, was more eloquent than any words. Mary, with the gold in her hands, felt the weight not only of the precious metal but of the complexity and dangers it brought with it. What would happen now? They asked for nothing in return. They simply offered help. The irony was not lost on him. He, a man of immense wealth, who owned land, mines, Jed, now stronger and able to move, tried to get up to go to the small stable to see his horse. The silence in the cabin was palpable, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire in the fireplace. Jed, who had kept his wealth and true identity a secret, was caught by surprise. The man they had saved, the wounded stranger who depended on their charity, was rich. Very rich. This discovery, unexpected and overwhelming, changed everything. As he reached for his boots, which were lying on the floor beside his makeshift bed, a heavy object fell from his pocket, something he had completely forgotten about. Mary, who had taken in a wounded stranger out of pure compassion, expecting nothing in return, without even dreaming of a reward, now found herself facing a fortune that could, in an instant, change her family's destiny. The poverty that tormented them, the specter of hunger that followed them, could finally come to an end. But the turning point brought not only relief, it also brought a new layer of mystery and a hint of distrust. Why was such a wealthy man alone in the desert, wounded, and keeping his wealth a secret? And why hadn't he revealed his identity or his wealth before? These questions hammered at Mary's mind. It was a small, old, worn leather pouch, which, upon falling, revealed the unmistakable golden gleam of gold nuggets spilling out onto the dirt floor. Lily, who was nearby, playing with her brother, saw the sparkle and picked up one of the nuggets, her eyes widening at the metallic shine. "Mommy, look! It's gold!" she exclaimed, extending the nugget and the pouch to Mary, who was preparing tea. And cattle had been saved by those who possessed almost nothing. He felt a sting of humility and unexpected gratitude. Her children, Lily and Tom, played quietly on the dirt floor, drawing with charcoal pieces on a wooden board, creating a make-believe world for themselves. Mary, noticing with a slight movement that he was awake, put down her sewing and approached. Her blue eyes, once clouded with worry and sleepless nights, now gleamed with a mix of relief and weariness. Mary offered him a cup of fresh water, which he drank eagerly, feeling life slowly return to his body with each sip. With each swallow, clarity seemed to return to his mind. Slowly, he began to remember the attack, the gunshots that caught him by surprise, falling from his horse, and the darkness that followed. But how had he gotten here? Who were these people? There was a glimmer of renewed hope in her gaze. "We brought you inside. Your horse is in our small stable. We took care of him." "You're awake," she said, her voice soft and hoarse, as if little used. "How do you feel?" Jed tried to speak, but his throat was dry and hoarse, as if it hadn't been used for days. "You were wounded, very badly, near our cabin," Mary explained, as if reading his thoughts, her voice calm and comforting. Jed nodded, his eyes scanning the small cabin, observing every detail of the place's simplicity and poverty. For days, Jed remained silent, observing the routine of Mary and her children with an attentive, thoughtful gaze. The turning point came unexpectedly and revealingly. Mary looked at the gold pouch, which now lay open on the floor, then at Jed, a mix of surprise, confusion, and a hint of distrust on her face. The revelation of the gold was a shock. Jed saw the change in Mary's eyes. The discovery of the gold drastically altered the atmosphere in the cabin. The initial surprise gave way to a palpable, almost electric tension. Mary, though relieved by the prospect of a less arduous future for her children, couldn't ignore the mystery surrounding Jed. Her world was simple. The cabin, her children, the daily struggle for survival, and the memory of her husband. And so that she and the children could finally have a dignified life free from misery. "We didn't help you for gold, Mr. Jedediah," she replied, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "We helped you because it was the right thing to do. I will accept enough to ensure my children don't starve and to repair this cabin, but the rest is yours." But now, a new and powerful motivation joined this, protecting Mary and her children. He felt a need to ensure their safety, to reciprocate the kindness he had received. And Mary, despite the paralyzing fear, felt she couldn't simply turn her back on Jed. Her moral compass prevented her. Uncertainty hung over the cabin like a dense fog, a mix of newfound hope, and the imminent shadow of a dangerous past that was about to catch up with them, changing everything forever. "And please, call me Mary. You saved me too." Jed, deeply impressed by her integrity and selflessness, accepted her condition but vowed he wouldn't forget her. "It's the least I can do," he said, his voice sincere and filled with gratitude. "You saved my life, Mary, and your kindness cannot be fully repaid with coins, but it can give you the future you and your children deserve, a future you never dreamed of." Jed's world was one of cruel betrayal, ruthless greed, violence, and constant danger. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the proximity of the danger that now surrounded her. He knew his pursuers wouldn't give up easily, and that, sooner or later, they would find them. The cabin, once a safe and isolated refuge, now seemed vulnerable, an easy target in the middle of the desert. Jed, even while recovering from his injuries, began to formulate a plan to leave, to continue his journey and seek justice. However, he could not in good conscience leave Mary and the children in danger. He felt a responsibility for them, a bond that had been forged in adversity and by Mary's kindness. If Silas Blackwood and his men were after Jed, they wouldn't hesitate to find him, and that would put Mary and her children at mortal risk. Jed, despite his recovering state, spent hours watching the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for any sign of danger, a dust cloud, or a distant sound. Mary, in turn, struggled internally with fear. She had grown fond of Jed, not just as the man she had saved, but as a strong and gentle presence that had filled a void in her life and her children's lives. But the danger he brought with him was real and palpable. Her children were everything to her, her only treasure, and the thought of putting them at risk terrified her. The balance between gratitude and maternal protective instinct weighed heavily on her heart. She held the heavy, gleaming gold pouch as if it were a forbidden object or a dangerous lure. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice low but firm, without averting her gaze. "And why are you carrying so much gold alone in the desert, wounded and in secret?" Jed, seeing that there was no longer any way to hide the truth, and feeling it was time to be honest with the woman who had saved his life, finally began to speak. His voice was still hoarse, but each word was laden with a story that seemed to belong to another world, far removed from Mary's simple, isolated life. He revealed himself to be Jedediah Stone, not a mere cowboy, but a prosperous rancher and miner from northern Texas, known for his vast land holdings and, more importantly, for a newly discovered gold mine that had made him incredibly wealthy. He was on the run. He had been brutally ambushed by a group of men led by his own business partner, Silas Blackwood, an ambitious, unscrupulous, and power-hungry man who had tried to steal his land, his cattle, and the valuable gold mine map Jed carried with him. Jed had narrowly escaped, his horse, Thunder, carrying him far from immediate danger. But the attack had left him severely wounded, on the verge of death. He was on his way to seek justice from the law in a distant town, Silver Creek, hoping to recover what was rightfully his. Yet's words were a whirlwind of information for Mary, a shock of reality that plunged her into a world she could barely conceive. Jed, sensing Mary's hesitation and genuine fear, and feeling the weight of his debt, offered her a considerable portion of the gold as payment for her help. Mary, though tempted by the promise of a better future for her children, for the first time in a long while, refused most of the offer, her dignity unshakable. The tension escalated exponentially when Jed revealed to Mary that Silas Blackwood was a relentless man, known for his cruelty and for not giving up on his objectives. The nights in the cabin became more restless, filled with whispers and tense silences. Yet's motivation was clear: revenge and justice. He wanted to reclaim what was his and make Silas pay for his betrayal and attempted murder. The calm before the storm was almost deafening, an oppressive silence that foreshadowed danger. Jed, Mary, and the children lived in escalating tension. Every shadow cast by the distant mountains, a potential threat. Jed had largely regained his physical strength, but he knew that, even with his skill in handling a weapon, he was at a numerical disadvantage against a group of armed men, relentless and determined to find him. He spent hours practicing with John's old rifle, cleaning it and honing his aim, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Mary, in turn, tried to maintain a routine of normalcy for the children, telling stories and singing songs. "You won't take anything, Silas. Not the gold, not my land, and you won't hurt anyone else." But fear was a constant veil over her eyes, a worry she tried to hide so as not to frighten them. Silas and his men opened fire, and Jed returned fire with precision, the gunshots echoing through the desert, breaking the peace of the twilight. With a hasty kiss on her children's hair, she whispered, "Stay here, my angels. No matter what happens, don't come out." Mary opened the cellar lid and crawled out, taking advantage of the momentary distraction. Mary had fired John's old rifle, aiming at a strategic point to cause a distraction and buy time. Before Silas could recover from the shock of the distraction, Jed attacked him, tackling him with a precise blow. A brutal, desperate hand-to-hand fight ensued. Jed, though still in pain from his wounded arm, used his strength and accumulated rage to subdue Silas. With a final blow, he disarmed him, kicking his weapon away and pinned him down, keeping him on the ground with his knee on his chest. The bullet, though it didn't hit anyone, struck the wooden wall with a deafening thud, startling the horses and catching the men by surprise. The scene was a climax of pure emotion and tension. Jed, panting, looked at Mary, a mix of profound gratitude and silent reprimand in his gaze. "What were you thinking, Mary?" he asked, but a smile of relief and admiration formed on his face. Mary could only smile back, exhausted but victorious, her legs trembling. The children, hearing the sudden silence in their mother's voice, crawled out of the cellar, seeing Jed and Mary unharmed, and ran to embrace them, crying with relief. The danger had passed. Silas and the henchman turned towards the barn, momentarily confused, their triumphant expressions turning to shock. The plan was risky, almost suicidal, but she saw no other option. She crouched and ran to the barn, her heart pounding in her chest. And the sound of gunshots, Mary, in the dark cellar, listened to the violence with her heart in her throat. Lily and Tom were nestled in her arms, trembling uncontrollably, their little faces buried in her chest. Mary knew she had to do something. She couldn't just wait for the end. Yet's life, and consequently her children's safety, depended on it. She remembered an old hunting rifle of John's, a Remington 1875, that he had kept in the barn for special occasions. It wasn't a powerful weapon for a direct confrontation, but it could serve as a crucial distraction. The confrontation was brutal and unequal. Jed was an experienced marksman, with years of practice in hunting and cattle protection, but the number of enemies was overwhelming. He moved from cover to cover, using the cabin as a shield, shooting with deadly accuracy. One of Silas's henchmen fell to the ground with a cry of pain, and Silas growled with rage, his eyes red with fury. The premonition came true on a sweltering afternoon, when the scorching sun beat down on the desert. From the horizon, a small dust cloud rose, growing rapidly, revealing the silhouettes of several horsemen approaching at high speed. It was them. Silas and his last henchman approached, cruel, victorious smiles on their faces. "This is the end of the line, Jedediah." Silas sneered, raising his weapon for the final shot, the shot that would end everything. Silas Blackwood and his 3 henchmen, riding as if hell itself were pursuing them. Jed, who was watching from the cabin window, acted quickly. "They're here," he shouted, his voice cutting through the air like thunder. "Mary, grab the children and hide in the cellar. Don't come out for anything, no matter what happens." Mary, her heart racing and her mouth dry with pure terror, grabbed Lily and Tom, who were visibly frightened, their small bodies trembling. She pushed them into the small cellar under the floorboards, a safe, dark place that John had built to store supplies and now to protect them. She knew she had to trust Jed, even though fear gnawed at her insides. As she closed the heavy wooden lid, she could hear the sound of horses rapidly approaching the creaking wood as Jed barred the cabin's main door with a beam, and the tense silence that followed a silence that seemed to scream danger. Silas Blackwood, a corpulent man with a scarred face and cold, cruel eyes, dismounted from his horse, followed by his 3 henchmen, all armed and with grim expressions. "Jedediah Stone," he bellowed, his deep voice cutting through the air like a whip, laden with hatred and greed. "I knew you couldn't run from me forever, you rat. Hand over the map and the gold, and maybe I'll be quick and merciful enough not to make you suffer." Jed appeared at the cabin door, his rifle in hand, his expression determined, not a visible trace of fear on his face. Negotiation was useless. a farce. As the battle raged outside, with the smell of gunpowder, she waited for a brief silence in the gunfire, a sign that there was a lull in the shooting, an opportunity. Jed was cornered. He had taken down 2 of Silas's henchmen, but he had been grazed in the arm and had only 1 bullet left in his revolver. It was at that precise moment that a gunshot echoed, not from the cabin, but from the barn, surprising everyone. This was Yet's chance. With a quick, decisive movement, he fired his last bullet, hitting the henchman in the shoulder, making him drop his weapon. Mary emerged from the barn, the heavy rifle trembling in her hands, her eyes fixed on Silas, who was now defeated. The sun began to set, painting the desert sky in hues of orange, purple, and red, a silent and magnificent testament to the drama that had unfolded. Silas Blackwood, disarmed, bound, and defeated, lay on the ground, his arrogance shattered by the courage of a widow and a wounded cowboy. Jed, with Mary's help, searched the fallen henchman, finding not only more gold and stolen goods, but also documents and evidence that proved Silas's crimes, including letters and a forged will he would have used to try and seize Yet's properties. The package revealed an even larger pouch of gold nuggets, far more than Mary had seen in her entire life. Her voice was choked with emotion. "I don't know what to say. Just accept it. It's my most sincere gratitude. And ... When all this is settled, when justice is done, I will return." Mary. He had invested part of his fortune in Silver Creek, bringing prosperity to the small town, building new stores, and helping to develop the community. That simple act of taking in a stranger on the verge of death not only saved a life, but also changed the fate of an entire family, proving that sometimes those who have the least are the ones who give the most, and that true wealth lies not in gold, but in the bonds. We create the kindness we spread and the courage to follow our hearts. Jed and Mary began a new life together, a life built on the foundation of kindness, courage, integrity, and a love that bloomed amidst the harshest adversity. What act of kindness, however small, do you believe could change the course of your own story? The cabin, once a symbol of suffering and deprivation, became a home of love, prosperity, and a united family. I would like to know if you would give me the honor of trying to build something new with you, something beyond gold and revenge, something that begins here, in this place, with you and your children. Yet's proposal was more than a promise of return. It was an invitation to a shared future, an invitation to a life together. Mary, moved and with her heart full of a joy she hadn't felt in a long time, accepted with a smile and a nod, a silent promise of a new beginning. She began, trying to find the right words. With Yet's gold and the map to the silver mine, Mary began to rebuild their lives. She hired local workers from Dusty Gulch to repair the cabin. The roof was mended, the walls reinforced, new furniture was bought from town, and the land, with hard work, quality seeds, and the new tools she could afford, began to flourish again, transforming into a small oasis. Lily and Tom, with new clothes, leather shoes, and full stomachs, played and laughed again, their smiles shining like the gold that had changed their lives forever. "I cannot repay you for your kindness and for what you've done for me, but I can give you the chance to have a life you and your children deserve, a life free from misery. This gold is yours. Use it to rebuild your life, to give Lily and Tom everything they need: education, security, and a future. And this map." He pointed to a specific mark on the map, a distant spot in the mountains. "There's a small silver and copper vein not far from here. It's not a gold mine, but it's enough to sustain you for generations if you know how to manage it wisely." Justice, though late and violent, had come to the desert, delivered by the hands of those least expected. Jed decided he would take Silas and the living henchman to the nearest town, Silver Creek, where there was a trustworthy sheriff and a court that could try Silas for his crimes. It was a dangerous journey, but he knew it was the only way to ensure Silas faced the law and that his name and reputation were fully restored. Before leaving, Jed turned to Mary, his blue eyes filled with profound gratitude and something more, something he couldn't name, but that was undeniable. It was respect, admiration, and a kind of affection that had grown amidst adversity. "Mary," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you saved my life, and not just once. You and your children showed me a kindness, a purity of heart that I had forgotten existed in this world. This cabin, this place, it's not just a refuge, it's special. It's a home of miracles. And you, Mary, you are the bravest and most worthy woman I have ever known in my entire life." He knelt, taking a small leather-wrapped package from his pocket, and then a mind map, the same one Silas had tried to steal. Mary, tears in her eyes that shimmered in the sunset light, looked at the gold, then at Jed. "Don't say anything," Jed interrupted gently, placing his hand over hers. Jed departed with the prisoners, taking them to justice, leaving Mary and the children in the cabin, which was now no longer a home of misery and suffering, but a place of renewed hope. Months passed, and Jed kept his promise. He returned with justice served and his name completely cleared, his reputation restored. Mary and Yet's story echoed throughout the Old West, a legend passed by word of mouth, a powerful reminder that compassion, even in the most difficult times and in a cruel world, can bring unexpected rewards and transform destinies. This is a tale of redemption and sacrifice, of how faith and hope can emerge from the most unlikely places.